He humiliated her in public, certain he would face no consequences. He had no idea whose wife she was. When Chuck Norris returned, the situation spiraled out of control, and there was no way back. Watch till the end to see how a single mistake changes everything. The morning began quietly, in the way mornings often do when a house is holding its breath. Light crept through the curtains in thin, pale lines, touching the walls and furniture without urgency, as if even the sun understood that this was a fragile time. The apartment was tidy but not immaculate, lived in a way that spoke of routine and care rather than order for its own sake. On the kitchen table lay a folded list written in careful handwriting, items circled and recircled, notes added in the margins and then crossed out again. It was the kind of list that had been rewritten several times, not because the items changed, but because the act of rewriting helped calm the mind. Chuck moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, setting a kettle on the stove, rinsing a mug, glancing now and then toward the bedroom door. He moved more softly than he usually did, aware of every sound his footsteps made, every clink of ceramic or metal. There was a tension in him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with responsibility. In the weeks leading up to the birth, that feeling had grown heavier, settling into his chest like a constant pressure he could neither ignore nor release. His wife emerged slowly from the bedroom, one hand resting instinctively against her lower back. The other braced briefly on the doorframe as she adjusted to standing. The pregnancy was well into its final stretch now. Her movements had become measured, deliberate, not because she lacked strength, but because she had learned the cost of moving too quickly. There was a quiet discipline in the way she carried herself, a habit formed long before pregnancy by years of working as a nurse on night shifts, learning to conserve energy and maintain control even when her body protested. She crossed the room and sat at the table, exhaling as she lowered herself into the chair. Chuck watched her closely, trying not to let his concerns show too clearly. He knew she disliked being hovered over. Independence was part of who she was, as essential to her as her compassion or her competence. She had spent years caring for others in moments of vulnerability, and pregnancy had not erased that sense of purpose. If anything, it had sharpened it. The kettle began to whistle softly. Chuck poured the water, added tea, and brought the mug to her. She accepted it with a small nod of thanks, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the muted sounds of the city outside, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional car door slamming somewhere below. They spoke briefly about the day ahead, not as a grand plan, but as a series of small practical steps. There were still things to buy before the birth, items that had been postponed because there always seemed to be more time. Baby supplies, medical essentials, a few things she insisted on choosing herself because she trusted her own judgment more than any online recommendation. She knew which materials irritated sensitive skin, which products were more likely to cause reactions, which labels were misleading. Her training as a nurse had made her meticulous, and motherhood had only intensified that instinct. Chuck suggested waiting another day. He pointed out the fatigue in her eyes, the faint swelling in her ankles, the way she shifted slightly in her chair, as if searching for a more comfortable position. He tried to frame it as a practical concern rather than a command, but she heard the worry beneath his words anyway. She smiled at him, tired but patient, and reminded him that she had worked 12-hour night shifts while pregnant, that walking through a shopping center in the middle of the day was not going to defeat her. There was no argument, only a familiar exchange of looks that carried years of shared understanding. Chuck knew when to let the subject go. He also knew when to stay close. The drive to the shopping center was uneventful. Traffic moved steadily, the sky overhead clear and pale, the kind of day that promised nothing extraordinary. Chuck parked the car and came around to help her out, offering his arm without making a show of it. She took it briefly, then released him, adjusting her jacket and setting her own pace. They walked side by side toward the entrance, their reflections briefly visible in the glass doors as they passed through. Inside, the mall was already busy. Voices overlapped in a constant low murmur, punctuated by the occasional laughter of children or the mechanical announcement from a store speaker. Bright lights reflected off polished floors, and the air carried the mixed scents of coffee, perfume, and disinfectant. Chuck felt the familiar awareness settle over him, the instinct to scan his surroundings without consciously thinking about it. Years of habit made him attentive to movement, posture, tone. He noticed the security guards near the entrances, the placement of cameras in the ceilings, the flow of people moving between stores. His wife noticed other things. She took in the layout of displays, the spacing between aisles, the availability of benches. She adjusted her breathing, aware that enclosed, crowded spaces sometimes made her feel lightheaded. Still, she moved with quiet determination, checking items off the list in her mind as they entered the first store. They spent some time together there, moving slowly, examining shelves, discussing choices in low voices. She compared labels, frowned at certain ingredients, nodded approvingly at others. Chuck carried the basket, careful not to bump into anyone as they navigated narrow aisles. He could feel her fatigue increasing, subtle signs only someone who knew her well would notice. The slight hesitation before standing straight, the way her hand returned again and again to her back, the small pauses she took as if waiting for her body to catch up. When they reached the checkout area, Chuck suggested sitting down while he paid. She agreed, easing herself onto a bench near the counter. As he stood in line, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, his brow tightening slightly. It was a call he couldn't ignore, brief but necessary, something related to a matter he had promised to handle. He hesitated, looking back at her. She waved him off gently, a silent reassurance that she would be fine for a few minutes. He stepped aside to take the call, keeping her in his line of sight as much as possible. She sat quietly, resting one hand on her stomach, the other on her knee, breathing steadily. Around her, people passed without paying much attention. A couple argued softly near a display. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking for something she didn't answer immediately. When Chuck returned, the transaction was complete. He gathered the bags and suggested moving on to the next store. She rose slowly, nodding, and they walked together into the wider corridor of the mall. The space was louder here, more chaotic, and she felt the strain more acutely. Her head throbbed faintly, and she became aware of a dull ache spreading through her lower back. She told herself it was nothing she hadn't felt before, nothing she couldn't manage. They approached a pharmacy near the center of the mall, one of the last places on their list. Inside, the lighting was harsher, more clinical. Shelves rose in neat rows, stocked with boxes and bottles arranged with precise symmetry. She moved ahead slightly, already scanning for the items she needed, her professional instincts guiding her almost automatically. Chuck followed, but his phone vibrated again. This time the message was more urgent. He read it quickly, jaw tightening. He hesitated, then leaned toward her, explaining that he needed a few minutes to take care of something nearby. He gestured toward an ATM and a customer service desk visible just outside the store. She looked at him, assessing him in return, then nodded. She told him she would finish choosing the remaining items and wait by the counter. He placed the basket near her and squeezed her hand briefly before turning away. As he left the store, she watched his back for a moment, then refocused on the shelf in front of her. The air inside the pharmacy felt dry, and she swallowed, suddenly aware of a faint dizziness creeping in. She adjusted her stance, leaning slightly against the shelf for support, careful not to draw attention to herself. She took a slow breath, then another, grounding herself the way she had taught patients to do countless times. She reached for a box, examined it, then returned it to the shelf. A flicker of unease passed through her, the sense that she was being watched. She glanced up and saw a uniformed security guard standing near the end of the aisle, his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary. She looked away, telling herself not to overreact. People watched others all the time, especially in public places. Still, the feeling remained, subtle but persistent. She shifted her weight, feeling the baby move inside her, a small, reassuring reminder of why she was there in the first place. She placed one hand over her stomach, steadying herself, and waited for Chuck to return. The quiet tension of the moment settled around her, unnoticed by most of the people passing by. It was the kind of moment that seemed insignificant from the outside, ordinary and unremarkable. Yet beneath its surface, something had already begun to change, a sequence set in motion that could not be undone. The sense of being watched did not fade. It lingered in the air around her, subtle but persistent, like a draft slipping through an unseen crack. She told herself it was nothing more than fatigue sharpening her instincts, the natural wariness that came with being heavily pregnant in a crowded place. Still, she adjusted her posture, straightening slightly, forcing her shoulders back as she had done countless times during night shifts when exhaustion threatened to show. She selected another item from the shelf and examined it carefully, reading the fine print even though her eyes were beginning to ache. The letters blurred for a moment and she blinked several times, breathing slowly through her nose. The pharmacy was warm, almost stifling, and the steady hum of fluorescent lights pressed against her temples. She became acutely aware of her own body, of the weight she carried, of the strain that radiated through her lower back and legs. It was not pain exactly, but a heavy insistence, a reminder that her reserves were not infinite. She stepped away from the shelf and moved toward the counter, intending to wait there until Chuck returned. Halfway across the aisle, she felt a brief wave of dizziness. It passed quickly, but she instinctively reached out, resting her hand against the edge of a display to steady herself. She kept her breathing slow and even, counting silently, using the same techniques she had once taught anxious patients in hospital corridors. It was then that the security guard approached. He did not rush toward her or raise his voice. He walked over with deliberate calm, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on her face rather than her hands or the items around her. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to make his presence unmistakable. She looked up, meeting his eyes without challenge, without fear. Years of professional training had taught her how to appear composed, even when she felt anything but. He asked if she was all right. The question itself was neutral, but the tone carried something else beneath it, a faint note of suspicion rather than concern. She nodded and told him she was fine, explaining that she was pregnant and feeling a little lightheaded. Her voice was steady, measured, the voice she used at work when reassuring others. He did not seem satisfied. His eyes flicked briefly to the shelves behind her, then back to her face. He asked if she needed assistance, his gaze lingering too long, his stance subtly blocking her path toward the exit of the aisle. She felt a tightening in her chest, not panic yet, but a warning. She repeated that she was fine and that her husband would be back shortly. She gestured vaguely toward the front of the store, hoping that would be enough. Instead, he asked her to come with him, just for a moment, so they could make sure everything was okay. The phrasing was polite, almost courteous, but the implication was clear. This was no longer a casual inquiry. She hesitated, her mind running through possibilities. She had done nothing wrong. She was standing in a store, holding unpaid items in plain view, not attempting to leave. There was no reason for her to be escorted anywhere. She explained again, calmly, that she was a nurse, that she understood the symptoms she was experiencing, and that she did not need help. She mentioned her pregnancy once more, hoping the visible reality of it would register. The guard's expression did not change. He asked for identification. The request struck her as excessive. She felt a flicker of indignation rise, quickly tamped down by caution. She had seen how easily small misunderstandings could escalate, especially when authority was involved. She reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, making sure her movements were visible and non-threatening. As she searched for her ID, she noticed people beginning to glance in their direction. A woman near the counter paused mid-conversation. A man further down the aisle slowed his steps. Curiosity piqued. The sense of exposure intensified, her discomfort sharpening into something closer to fear. She handed over her identification. The guard examined it briefly, his eyes narrowing as he read. He did not comment on her profession or her address. He handed it back without apology and told her to wait. Wait for what? She asked, keeping her voice level. He told her they just wanted to make sure everything was in order. The words sounded rehearsed, empty. She felt the first real surge of anxiety then, a tightening in her stomach that had nothing to do with the baby. She shifted her weight again, her back protesting the prolonged standing. She asked if she could sit down while they waited. The guard hesitated, then nodded, gesturing toward a small bench near the pharmacy counter. She moved toward it slowly, carefully, aware of every step. As she lowered herself onto the bench, she felt the eyes of others on her, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Minutes passed. The guard stood a short distance away, speaking quietly into a radio. She caught fragments of his words, nothing specific, but the tone was enough to make her uneasy. She glanced toward the entrance of the store, hoping to see Chuck returning, but he was nowhere in sight. Her breathing became more deliberate as she tried to calm herself. She placed both hands over her stomach, feeling the steady reassurance of movement beneath her palms. She told herself that this would pass, that someone would soon realize the mistake and let her go about her day. Instead, the situation deepened. Two more security personnel appeared, standing together a few feet away. They did not approach her directly, but their presence was unmistakable. One of them glanced at her briefly, then looked away, as if she were already categorized, filed under some internal label. She felt a flush of humiliation rise to her cheeks. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated as a problem, as a potential threat or inconvenience. The realization stung more sharply than she expected. She had spent her life caring for others, advocating for patients who were frightened, vulnerable, misunderstood. Now she found herself in that very position, stripped of authority, reduced to an object of suspicion. She decided to speak up again, to clarify, to assert her rights without provoking confrontation. She explained once more that she was pregnant, that standing and stress were not good for her condition, and that her husband would be back shortly. She asked why this was necessary. The response was vague. They were just being cautious. There had been concerns. Procedures had to be followed. The words felt hollow, disconnected from reality. Procedures, she knew, were meant to protect people, not humiliate them. A few moments later, she heard the unmistakable sound of a police radio crackling nearby. Her heart skipped. She looked up just in time to see a uniformed officer entering the pharmacy, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Conversations hushed. Movement slowed. The authority he carried was palpable, filling the space more effectively than any raised voice could have. He approached the group of guards first, listening briefly as one of them spoke in low tones. She watched his face as he listened, searching for any sign of empathy or neutrality. Instead, she saw impatience, a readiness to assert control rather than understand. The officer turned toward her. He did not ask how she was feeling. He did not acknowledge her pregnancy. His gaze swept over her quickly, assessing, judging. He asked her to stand up. She did so carefully, pushing herself up from the bench with one hand braced against the seat. She felt exposed standing there, surrounded by uniforms, the soft murmur of the store pressing in on her from all sides. He asked for her identification again. She handed it over, her fingers trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. He looked at it longer than the guard had, his expression hardening as he read. He asked her what she was doing in the store. The question caught her off guard. She answered truthfully, explaining that she was shopping, that she felt unwell due to pregnancy, that her husband had stepped away briefly. She spoke clearly, choosing her words with care. The officer interrupted her mid-sentence. He told her that her behavior had been reported as suspicious. He did not specify what that meant. He told her that she needed to comply and answer his questions. The shift was unmistakable. What had begun as a supposed welfare check had become an interrogation. She felt a surge of frustration, followed quickly by fear. She could sense the power imbalance widening, the ground slipping beneath her feet. She tried again to assert herself, mentioning her profession, her condition, her right to be treated with respect. The officer's response was sharp. He told her that her job did not exempt her from scrutiny. He questioned her tone, her attitude, implying that she was being uncooperative. Around them, phones began to appear, raised discreetly but unmistakably. The knowledge that she was being filmed added another layer of distress. Every movement, every expression could be misinterpreted, replayed without context. She asked if she could call her husband. The officer did not answer immediately. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his presence looming. He told her to remain where she was and stop asking questions. The words struck her like a physical blow. She felt her pulse quicken, her breath becoming shallow. The baby shifted again, and fear spiked through her chest, sharp and urgent. She placed one hand protectively over her stomach, instinct overriding decorum. The officer noticed the gesture, but dismissed it with a glance. He reached out, gripping her arm, not violently at first, but firmly enough to make his intent clear. That was the moment when the situation crossed an invisible line. She did not resist. She did not pull away. She froze, her mind racing, her body tense. She tried to speak, to explain, to de-escalate, but her words seemed to dissolve before they reached him. He told her to move. She struggled to comply, her balance unsteady, her body heavy and unresponsive under stress. He tightened his grip, frustration evident in his posture. Around them, the pharmacy felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. The low murmur of the crowd swelled, edged with shock and confusion. Someone nearby said something she could not quite hear. Another voice called out, uncertain, hesitant. The officer's patience snapped. With a sharp movement, he turned her toward the wall, pressing her forward. Her shoulder made contact first, then her side. Pain flared briefly, followed by a wave of panic so intense it nearly stole her breath. She cried out, not loudly but sharply, the sound involuntary. Her mind screamed one thought above all others: protect the baby. She twisted slightly, trying to shield her stomach, her hands searching for purchase against the smooth surface of the wall. The officer's grip did not loosen. His voice rose, commanding, harsh, echoing in her ears. She could feel eyes on her from every direction now. Phones were raised openly. The situation had become a spectacle, and she was trapped at its center. Somewhere beyond the chaos, time seemed to slow. The sounds blurred together, the lights too bright, the pressure too much. She felt tears prick at her eyes, not from pain alone, but from the crushing humiliation of being treated this way in public, powerless to stop it. She thought of Chuck then, not as a solution, but as a distant anchor, the last point of safety she could imagine. She wondered if he was close enough to hear, if he would come in time. The officer pressed her harder against the wall, his voice ringing with authority and anger. The final shred of control she had over the situation slipped away, and at that precise moment, as fear crested into something overwhelming, footsteps sounded behind them, fast and unmistakably purposeful. She did not turn her head. She did not need to. She felt it before she saw it, the sudden shift in the air, the instinctive awareness that something had changed. Chuck had returned. The officer's presence dominated the space in a way that felt deliberate, practiced. He stood close enough that she could smell the faint scent of aftershave mixed with the sterile odor of the pharmacy. Close enough that every movement of his body translated into pressure on hers. His uniform was immaculate, the creases sharp, the badge catching the harsh overhead light. It was the kind of visual authority that left little room for doubt about who was in control, and he carried it with an ease that suggested this was not unfamiliar territory for him. He spoke again, louder now, his voice carrying beyond the immediate circle of bodies and drawing more attention from the surrounding customers. His words were clipped and commanding, not meant to invite explanation or understanding. They were meant to assert dominance, to establish a hierarchy in which she occupied the lowest possible rung. He repeated his demand that she comply, framing her hesitation as defiance rather than fear. She tried to respond, her voice strained but still measured. She explained once more that she was pregnant, that the situation was being misunderstood, that she was not resisting anything. She could feel the tremor in her hands as she spoke, the effort it took to keep her tone even. Every instinct she had told her that escalation would only make things worse, that she needed to remain calm no matter how unfair the circumstances became. The officer did not listen, or perhaps he listened only long enough to decide that her words were irrelevant. He tightened his grip on her arm, his fingers digging into muscle with a firmness that sent a sharp jolt of pain through her. It was not yet the kind of force that would leave visible bruises immediately, but it was unmistakably physical, unmistakably coercive. The message was clear. He would move her whether she wanted to move or not. She stumbled slightly as he pulled her forward. The sudden motion disrupted her balance, and a wave of panic surged through her chest. She instinctively reached one hand toward her stomach, curling her body inward to protect the life she carried. The movement was reflexive, born of fear rather than defiance. But the officer interpreted it differently. He barked at her to keep her hands where he could see them. The words echoed, sharp and accusatory, and she felt a flush of heat spread across her face. Around them, the crowd had thickened. People stood frozen in place, drawn by the spectacle, yet uncertain how to react. Some looked away quickly, uncomfortable. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of shock, confusion, and morbid curiosity. Several phones were now raised openly, their lenses trained on her, on the officer, on the unfolding scene. The knowledge that she was being recorded intensified her humiliation. Every tremor in her voice, every involuntary movement of fear was being captured, stripped of context, preserved indefinitely. She felt exposed in a way that went beyond physical vulnerability. She was being reduced to an image, a moment, a problem to be debated later by strangers who had not felt the officer's grip or the fear tightening her chest. The officer shifted his stance, positioning himself more squarely between her and the open space of the store. His body blocked her view of the exit, his presence cutting off any illusion of escape. He spoke again, accusing her of not following instructions, of making things more difficult than necessary. The tone was scolding, almost paternal, as if he were correcting a child rather than confronting a frightened, pregnant woman. She shook her head, a small, involuntary gesture. She wanted to say that she was trying, that her body simply could not move the way he demanded, that stress and sudden movements could put her baby at risk. The words tangled in her throat, her breath catching as the pressure of the situation mounted. Her heart raced, each beat loud in her ears. The officer's patience thinned visibly, his jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his temple. He glanced briefly at the surrounding crowd, at the phones pointed in his direction, then back at her. Whatever calculation he made in that moment did not favor restraint. He moved her toward the wall with a sharp turn, guiding her with a force that left no room for negotiation. Her shoulder struck first, the impact jarring enough to draw a sharp gasp from her throat. Before she could regain her footing, he pressed her forward, pinning her more firmly against the surface. The wall was cold and unyielding against her skin, the pressure uneven, uncomfortable. Pain flared along her side, followed immediately by fear. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she struggled to orient herself. She could feel the baby shift inside her, a sudden, unsettling movement that sent a spike of terror through her chest. She cried out then, not as a protest, but as an involuntary response to the fear that something might be wrong. Her hands fumbled against the wall as she tried to brace herself, to create some distance between her stomach and the hard surface. The officer did not adjust his position. His grip remained firm, his weight angled in a way that kept her immobilized. He raised his voice again, louder than before, commanding her to stop moving, to stop resisting. The words rang hollow in her ears. She was not resisting. She was trying to survive the moment. Someone in the crowd shouted something indistinct. Another voice murmured in protest, hesitant, uncertain. The noise of the store swelled, blending with the officer's commands and the low, constant hum of fluorescent lights. The environment felt overwhelming, every sensation amplified by stress. She felt tears spill from her eyes then, hot and unbidden. She had not cried when the security guard first approached her, nor when the officer questioned her. It was this moment, pressed against the wall, publicly restrained, her pregnancy ignored, that broke through her composure. The tears were not dramatic. They slipped silently down her cheeks, a physical manifestation of the fear and humiliation she could no longer contain. The officer noticed them and reacted with irritation rather than concern. He told her to calm down, as if the situation were her fault, as if her fear were an inconvenience rather than a consequence of his actions. His words carried no reassurance, no attempt to de-escalate. They were a dismissal of her humanity. She tried again to speak, her voice cracking as she pleaded for him to stop, to listen, to understand that she could not be treated this way. The words came out unevenly, fragments shaped by panic and desperation. She mentioned her baby, her condition, her husband. The officer cut her off. He leaned closer, his voice harsh and unyielding, warning her that making a scene would only make things worse for her. The threat was implicit, heavy with consequence. Around them, more phones appeared. The scene had crossed from uncomfortable to alarming, and people sensed it. A few stepped closer, emboldened by numbers, though none intervened directly. Others stayed back, afraid of drawing the officer's attention, afraid of becoming involved. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging as the tension thickened. She lost track of how long she had been pressed there, only aware of the strain in her muscles, the ache in her back, the burning fear that something irreversible might happen if the pressure continued. Her thoughts flickered rapidly, disjointed. She thought of the hospital corridors she knew so well, of the way she had once held the hands of frightened patients and told them they were safe. She thought of how easily safety could be stripped away, how fragile it was when power was misused. She thought of Chuck, of his promise to always be there, of the fact that he was not there now. The officer adjusted his grip again, shifting his hand higher on her arm, increasing the pressure. The movement startled her, and she gasped, her body tensing involuntarily. The wall pressed harder against her side, and she felt a sharp, localized pain that made her cry out again. Louder this time. That sound cut through the noise of the store, raw and unmistakable. For a brief moment, there was a ripple of reaction in the crowd. People murmured, some voices raised in protest, others in alarm. A woman nearby stepped forward as if to intervene, then stopped, uncertainty freezing her in place. The officer did not turn to acknowledge any of it. His focus remained fixed on the woman pinned against the wall, as if she were the sole source of disorder in the room. He told her to stay still. She could not. Her body shook, the adrenaline coursing through her, too strong to suppress. She shifted again, trying to angle herself in a way that protected her stomach, her hands sliding uselessly against the wall. The effort cost her what little breath she had left, and she sagged slightly under his grip. The officer interpreted the movement as defiance. His voice rose again, sharp and angry, echoing off the hard surfaces around them. He leaned more of his weight into her, the pressure sudden and overwhelming. Panic surged white-hot, drowning out everything else. She felt her vision blur at the edges, a ringing starting in her ears. She was aware of the crowd only dimly now, of the phones capturing every second, of the lights glaring overhead. Her world had narrowed to the wall against her body, the officer's grip, and the urgent, singular need to protect her child. It was in that narrowing of awareness that she felt a shift, subtle but unmistakable, a change in the energy of the space behind her. The officer's posture stiffened slightly, his attention momentarily diverted. She heard footsteps, fast and purposeful, cutting through the noise with a clarity that made her heart lurch. Before she could turn her head, before she could fully register what was happening, the air around her seemed to change. The pressure on her arm wavered, just enough for her to notice. A voice spoke behind the officer, low and controlled, carrying a weight that demanded attention. She did not see Chuck yet. She did not need to. She felt the moment shift, felt the balance of power tremble for the first time since the officer had arrived. The fear did not vanish, but something else joined it now, something like hope, fragile and uncertain. The escalation had reached its peak, and the moment of intervention had arrived. The first thing Chuck registered was the sound. Not words, not the officer's voice specifically, but the tone of the space itself, the way the air vibrated with tension, the way conversations had dropped into a charged hush, punctuated by sharp commands and uneasy murmurs. He had crossed the threshold of the pharmacy with the lingering mindset of errands and obligations still clinging to him, his phone just lowered from his ear, the echo of a practical conversation still ringing in his head. That illusion shattered the moment he saw the crowd. People stood too close together, their bodies angled inward, attention fixed on a single point near the far wall. Phones were raised, not discreetly now, but openly, arms extended, faces set with the strange, detached intensity of witnesses who knew they were watching something that should not be happening and yet could not look away. Chuck felt a tightening in his chest before he understood why. Then he saw her. She was pressed against the wall, her body turned awkwardly, one shoulder higher than the other, her posture strained and defensive. Her hands were braced against the surface, fingers splayed, as if the wall were the only thing keeping her upright. The curve of her stomach was unmistakable even from a distance. The vulnerable arc of it made all the more jarring by the force being applied to her. An officer stood close behind her, his hand gripping her arm, his body angled in a way that left no doubt about who was exerting control. For a fraction of a second, everything inside Chuck went white. The world narrowed to a single, blinding focus. The sounds of the store blurred into a dull roar, and the faces of the onlookers became indistinct shapes at the edges of his vision. There was a surge of heat through his chest, a visceral, primal reaction that rose faster than thought. It would have been effortless, even to let that surge dictate his next move. He did not. Years of discipline asserted themselves in the space between impulse and action. He stopped walking, just for a breath, forcing himself to take in the scene with clarity rather than fury. He measured distance, posture, positioning. He saw the way the officer's weight was distributed, the angle of his grip, the tension in his shoulders. He saw his wife's body language, the way she leaned away from the pressure, the way one hand hovered instinctively near her stomach. Most importantly, he saw the risk. Any reckless movement could worsen the situation. Any explosive reaction could be reframed, misinterpreted, turned against them. The presence of cameras, both mounted and handheld, meant that whatever happened next would not belong to the moment alone. It would be dissected, slowed down, judged by people who had not felt the fear or the urgency of that wall pressing into her side. Chuck moved forward then, quickly but not aggressively, his steps purposeful, his expression controlled. He did not shout. He did not announce himself. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, carrying a weight that cut through the noise without escalating it. The officer reacted to the sound behind him, his head turning slightly, irritation flickering across his face. His grip on her arm tightened reflexively, as if asserting his authority against an unseen challenge. Chuck closed the remaining distance in 2 strides. He positioned himself between the officer and his wife with deliberate precision, his body turning sideways to create a barrier without striking or shoving. His presence altered the geometry of the scene instantly. The officer found his space invaded, his leverage disrupted. Chuck's hand came up, not to strike, but to break the grip on her arm with a controlled movement that redirected force rather than opposing it head-on. The officer reacted instinctively, shifting his stance, attempting to reassert control. Chuck anticipated the motion. He stepped in closer, using the officer's momentum against him, guiding the arm downward and away from her body. The movement was fluid, efficient, born of training and restraint rather than aggression. She felt the pressure ease before she fully understood what had happened. The wall was still there, cold against her shoulder, but the crushing force that had pinned her was gone. She staggered slightly, her legs unsteady, and Chuck turned just enough to support her without fully taking his attention off the officer. He spoke to her quietly then, his voice close, grounding. He told her to step back, to breathe, to move away. She did as he said, retreating a few steps until she was no longer trapped, her hands trembling as she pressed them protectively against her stomach. Someone from the crowd moved a chair toward her, another person offering water. She sank down onto the seat, her breathing shallow but gradually slowing as the immediate threat receded. The officer, meanwhile, was no longer in control of the situation. He attempted to step forward again, his expression hardening, but Chuck was already there, his stance firm and balanced. He did not throw a punch. He did not strike. Instead, he redirected, pivoting and lowering his center of gravity, applying a controlled hold that limited the officer's movement without inflicting unnecessary harm. The officer struggled, more out of surprise than pain, his commands turning sharp and frantic as he realized the power dynamic had shifted. The crowd reacted audibly now. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Phones adjusted angles, capturing the sudden reversal. The image of a uniformed officer being restrained, rather than the other way around, sent a visible shock through the space. Chuck guided the officer down, not slamming him to the floor, but controlling the descent, ensuring that the officer's fall was the result of lost balance rather than violence. He held him there, maintaining pressure only where necessary, his grip firm but precise. The officer continued to protest, his voice raised, accusing, but his movements were constrained. Chuck remained silent. His focus was absolute. He kept one eye on the officer, monitoring his attempts to break free, and another on his wife, ensuring she was seated, supported, no longer in immediate danger. The dual awareness was exhausting but necessary. This was not about winning a fight. It was about ending a threat. Within moments, additional officers arrived, their presence announced by the shift in the crowd and the sudden flurry of movement at the edge of the scene. They took in the tableau with visible confusion. One of their own on the floor, restrained by a civilian, a pregnant woman seated nearby, shaken, a crowd of witnesses recording everything. Commands were shouted, hands hovered near belts. The tension spiked again, sharp and dangerous. Chuck did not move. He raised one hand slowly, deliberately, showing that he was not armed, that he was not escalating. He spoke calmly, explaining that the officer had been restraining his pregnant wife, that he had intervened to stop it, that he would release the hold once he was sure the threat had passed. His tone was controlled, respectful, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The arriving officers hesitated. One of them glanced toward the woman seated against the wall, taking in her pale face, the way her hands were clenched protectively over her stomach. Another looked at the phones held aloft, at the undeniable presence of cameras capturing every angle. Orders shifted, voices lowered. The immediate danger of a violent misunderstanding ebbed. Chuck released the hold slowly, rising to his feet but remaining close enough to prevent the officer from lunging again. The officer was helped up by his colleagues, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He began speaking rapidly, gesturing toward Chuck, toward the woman, attempting to reframe the narrative in his favor. Chuck listened without interruption. He knew better than to argue in that moment. The truth did not need to be shouted. It was already recorded from multiple angles, preserved in dozens of devices. Medical personnel were summoned, alerted by someone in the store. A uniformed supervisor arrived, his expression grave as he surveyed the scene. He asked questions, short and direct, his gaze moving between the officer, Chuck, and the woman seated nearby. She was examined where she sat, her vitals checked, her breathing assessed. The medic spoke quietly to her, asking about pain, about dizziness, about contractions. She answered as best she could, her voice steadier now but still fragile. Chuck stood close enough to reach her if she faltered, but careful not to interfere. The store felt different now. The earlier chaos had settled into a tense stillness, the kind that follows a sudden storm. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others speaking urgently into their phones. The spectacle had shifted from shock to scrutiny. Chuck felt the weight of what had happened settling in his chest. The adrenaline began to ebb, leaving behind a heavy awareness of consequences. He knew this moment would not end here. The intervention, necessary and controlled as it had been, would be questioned, dissected, challenged. The system would move next, and it would not move gently. But as he looked at his wife alive, conscious, no longer pinned against a wall, he knew he would make the same choice again. The escalation had been halted, not by force alone, but by restraint applied at exactly the moment it mattered most. The threat had been neutralized, but the aftermath was only beginning. As the supervisor signaled for formal statements to be taken and the crowd began to thin under instruction, Chuck placed a steadying hand on his wife's shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes still wet but clear, and in that look passed an unspoken understanding. They had crossed a line together, not by choice but by necessity. Behind them, the officer was being led away for questioning, his authority stripped of its immediacy, replaced by scrutiny. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, investigations, and a storm of attention neither of them had asked for. For now, though, the immediate danger had passed, and in the quiet space that followed, the reality of what came next began to take shape. The transition from crisis to procedure happened with unsettling speed. One moment the space had been charged with raw emotion and physical danger, and the next it was being reorganized by uniforms, protocols, and controlled voices. The pharmacy was partially cleared, customers guided away in careful waves, while a smaller perimeter formed around the center of the incident. What remained felt stripped and exposed, a stage after the climax of a play, littered not with props, but with the residue of fear. Medical personnel worked efficiently, their presence bringing a different kind of authority into the space. They knelt beside Chuck's wife, speaking softly, their questions precise and clinical. Blood pressure was taken, her pulse was counted. Fingers pressed gently against her wrist, her neck. One medic asked about pain, about dizziness, about tightening sensations in her abdomen. Another observed her breathing, the color of her skin, the way her hands trembled even as she tried to steady them. She answered as clearly as she could, drawing on years of professional instinct. She knew what they were looking for, what signs mattered most. She focused on describing sensations accurately, resisting the urge to minimize or exaggerate. Stress, she knew, could be as dangerous as physical trauma, especially now. She was acutely aware of the baby's movements, cataloging them silently, relieved when she felt a reassuring shift beneath her palms. Chuck stayed close, close enough that she could feel his presence even when her eyes were closed. He watched every motion the medics made, every expression that crossed their faces. The calm he had forced himself to maintain during the confrontation now required a different kind of discipline. This was waiting, uncertainty, the slow accumulation of consequences. There was no action he could take here, no threat to neutralize. All he could do was remain steady. Nearby, the officer who had restrained her was being questioned by a supervisor. His posture had changed. The confidence that had radiated from him earlier had dulled, replaced by irritation and something like disbelief. He spoke rapidly, gesturing as he talked, his version of events spilling out in fragments. He pointed toward Chuck, toward the wall, toward the space where the crowd had stood. Each gesture felt like an attempt to reclaim control through narrative, if not through force. Chuck was asked to step aside to give a preliminary statement. The request was polite but firm, delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He agreed without hesitation. He understood the importance of cooperation, especially now. He answered questions succinctly, describing what he had seen when he entered the store, what he believed to be happening, and the steps he had taken to stop it. He did not editorialize. He did not accuse. He stated facts. As he spoke, he noticed the subtle shifts in the supervisor's expression, the way his brow furrowed at certain details. The glance he cast toward the woman seated against the wall, pale and shaken, clearly pregnant. The moment when his eyes flicked to the phones still visible in the hands of onlookers, despite repeated instructions to step back. The recordings were impossible to ignore. Store management arrived, anxious and apologetic, offering access to security footage, assuring cooperation. The existence of cameras in every corner of the pharmacy, the mall corridors beyond, and the entrances leading in and out, created an unspoken undercurrent of inevitability. Whatever version of events anyone attempted to present would be weighed against footage that did not blink or forget. When the medics finished their initial assessment, they recommended further evaluation at a hospital, if only to monitor stress levels and ensure there were no delayed complications. She agreed without argument. The suggestion felt less like an imposition and more like a lifeline, a way to move out of the charged public space and into an environment where she felt some measure of control. As preparations were made for transport, another officer approached Chuck. This one spoke more carefully, his tone measured. He explained that, given the circumstances, Chuck would need to remain available for further questioning. The phrasing was neutral, but the implication was clear. The matter was not settled. It was only beginning. Chuck nodded. He asked if he could accompany his wife to the hospital. There was a brief hesitation, a glance exchanged between officers. Then a nod. Yes, he could go, but he would be contacted. Statements would be formalized later. There would be an investigation. The words hung heavy in the air. Outside, the world felt both unchanged and entirely different. The parking lot looked the same as it had an hour earlier. Cars coming and going, sunlight reflecting off windshields. Yet the normalcy felt surreal, almost offensive in its indifference. As the ambulance doors closed, muffling the sounds of the mall behind them, Chuck felt a wave of exhaustion crash over him. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a hollow ache. At the hospital, the pace slowed again into a rhythm he recognized. Monitors beeped softly, curtains were drawn, questions were asked and answered. Her condition stabilized, the immediate danger receding with each reassuring check. Still, the emotional toll lingered, manifesting in the way her hands clenched and unclenched, in the distant look that crossed her face when she stared at the ceiling. Chuck sat beside her bed, holding her hand, his thumb tracing small, steady circles against her skin. Neither of them spoke much. Words felt inadequate, too blunt for what they had just endured. When they did speak, it was about simple things: breathing, rest, the baby's movements, anchors in the present moment. The first messages began to arrive while they were still there. Friends asking if they were okay, colleagues expressing concern. A notification from a news outlet, the headline vague but unmistakable in its implication. A video was circulating. Someone had uploaded it. Others had shared it. The story was already escaping their control. By the time they returned home later that evening, the apartment no longer felt like the quiet refuge it had been that morning. The same walls, the same table, the same folded list lay waiting, but the air was different. He helped her settle onto the couch, arranging pillows, making sure she was comfortable. She leaned back, closing her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Every time she drifted, some fragment of the scene pulled her back, her body tensing as if bracing for impact that never came. Chuck stood at the window for a long time, watching the city lights flicker on, one by one. His phone buzzed intermittently with messages and missed calls. He did not answer most of them. He needed space to think, to prepare for what he knew was coming. The official contact came the next morning. An investigator from Internal Affairs introduced himself over the phone, his voice professional, detached. He explained that a formal investigation had been opened regarding the incident at the mall. Statements would be collected, evidence reviewed, there would be interviews. Chuck listened carefully, committing details to memory. He asked about his wife, about her status in the investigation. The investigator assured him she would be treated as a complainant, not a suspect. Still, the words did little to ease the underlying tension. As the day unfolded, the media presence intensified. Requests for comment arrived from multiple outlets. The video had spread further than either of them had anticipated, drawing strong reactions. Some condemned the officer's actions outright. Others questioned Chuck's intervention, framing it as excessive, dangerous, irresponsible. The debate unfolded rapidly, fueled by incomplete information and strong opinions. By the afternoon, the police union issued a statement. It was carefully worded, expressing concern while emphasizing the difficulty of policing and the need to support officers under stress. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The implication was clear enough. The officer's actions would be defended. Chuck read the statement in silence, then set his phone down. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not rage this time, but resolve. He had known this would not be simple. Systems rarely moved quickly or cleanly when their authority was challenged. That night, as he sat beside his wife in the dim light of the living room, he felt the weight of the days ahead settling in. There would be pressure. There would be attempts to shift blame, to complicate facts, to wear them down. The story would be told and retold, often without regard for the reality they had lived. He looked at her, at the quiet strength she had shown even in the face of humiliation and fear. He thought of the child they were waiting to meet, of the world that child would inherit. Whatever came next, he knew one thing with absolute clarity: they would not let this be buried. The strike had ended the immediate danger, but the aftermath was only beginning, and it would test them in ways neither of them had anticipated. The days that followed unfolded with a peculiar distortion of time. Hours passed in fragments, interrupted by phone calls, messages, and the constant low hum of attention that neither of them could escape. What had begun as a single moment in a crowded pharmacy had expanded outward, touching institutions, reputations, and narratives far beyond their control. The quiet routines of ordinary life meals, rest, simple conversations were now threaded with anticipation and strain. The investigation advanced on parallel tracks, each moving at its own pace and with its own logic. On one side were the official procedures, interviews scheduled with precise formality, requests for statements phrased in neutral language, emails marked confidential and time-sensitive. On the other was the public arena, where certainty was manufactured quickly and often without regard for nuance. The two spheres overlapped but never fully aligned, creating a sense that reality itself had been split into competing versions. Chuck accompanied his wife to her first formal interview at the hospital, a neutral setting chosen deliberately to accommodate her condition. The investigator arrived with a notebook and a recorder, his demeanor polite and restrained. He asked questions carefully, mindful of her pregnancy, allowing pauses when her breathing quickened or her hands began to tremble. She answered steadily, recounting events in the order they had occurred, resisting the urge to editorialize. She focused on sensations, actions, and words, grounding her account in what she could be certain of. As she spoke, the emotional weight of the memory pressed in. The investigator noted the way her posture changed when she described being pushed against the wall, the way her voice softened when she mentioned the fear for her baby. He asked clarifying questions, not to challenge her account, but to ensure its completeness. When the interview ended, he thanked her and assured her that her cooperation was appreciated. Outside the room, Chuck waited, listening to the muted sounds beyond the door. He had learned to read the rhythm of her breathing, the small signals that told him when she needed support. When she emerged, pale but composed, he stood and offered his arm. She took it without hesitation. His own interview came later that afternoon, conducted at a precinct far from the mall. The setting was intentionally impersonal. A small room, a table, 2 chairs, a camera mounted discreetly in the corner. He sat across from 2 investigators, one of whom asked most of the questions, while the other observed silently. Chuck answered in the same measured way he had from the beginning, sticking to verifiable facts, describing his actions with clarity and restraint. They asked about his training, his physical capabilities, his awareness of the officer's status at the moment he intervened. They asked why he had chosen the method he did, whether he believed any alternative action was possible. Chuck explained his reasoning carefully, emphasizing his focus on ending the immediate threat and protecting his wife without escalating the situation. He spoke of distance, leverage, and timing, framing his actions not as aggression, but as controlled intervention. The investigators listened without visible reaction. They took notes, asked follow-up questions, and thanked him for his time. As he left the building, Chuck felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with uncertainty. He knew that cooperation did not guarantee fairness, only the possibility of it. Meanwhile, evidence began to surface in ways that shifted the balance. Store management released security footage from multiple angles, each clip reinforcing the same sequence of events. The officer's approach, the tightening grip, the moment of force against the wall, and the clear presence of her pregnancy in frame. The footage circulated internally first, then, through legal channels and leaks, reached journalists who analyzed it frame by frame. The public reaction intensified. Commentators dissected the footage, some with genuine concern, others with opportunistic fervor. Experts weighed in, discussing use of force policies, the physiological risks of stress during pregnancy, and the responsibilities of law enforcement in public spaces. The narrative began to solidify around a central question. How had this been allowed to happen? As scrutiny grew, so did resistance. The police union escalated its involvement, releasing statements that framed the officers' actions as a response to perceived noncompliance. They emphasized the difficulty of making split-second decisions, the pressures officers faced, the dangers inherent in the job. They questioned Chuck's intervention, highlighting his physical training as evidence that his actions posed a risk. The implication was subtle but clear. The problem was not the initial restraint, but the civilian who challenged it. Behind the scenes, however, the official investigation continued to uncover uncomfortable details. Complaints against the officer surfaced, first quietly, then with increasing clarity. There were reports of excessive force, dismissive behavior, and confrontations that had ended without formal discipline. Each incident alone had been deemed inconclusive or insufficient. Together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Former colleagues spoke cautiously, some anonymously, describing a temperament prone to escalation. Past complainants, emboldened by the visibility of the current case, came forward with their own accounts. The accumulation of testimony added weight to the footage, transforming what some had attempted to frame as an isolated incident into something systemic. The pressure on the department mounted. Within the household, the strain manifested in quieter ways. Chuck's wife struggled with sleep, waking abruptly at night, her body tensing as if anticipating another sudden threat. She avoided crowded places, her confidence shaken. Even familiar routines felt fragile, easily disrupted by intrusive memories. Chuck noticed the way she flinched at raised voices on television, the way her hand returned instinctively to her stomach whenever tension rose. He encouraged rest, tried to create a sense of normalcy, but he could not insulate her completely from the reality of what was unfolding. Every news update, every message from a concerned friend, reminded them that the story was still alive, still evolving. Chuck, too, felt the toll. The discipline that had served him in moments of crisis was harder to maintain over weeks of scrutiny. He found himself replaying the scene in the pharmacy, questioning each movement, each decision. He knew he had acted correctly, yet doubt crept in during quiet moments, fed by headlines and commentary that reduced complex reality to simplified judgment. There were days when the pressure felt relentless. Requests for interviews multiplied. Legal counsel advised caution, reminding them that public statements could complicate proceedings. Chuck declined most invitations to speak, understanding that restraint now was as important as it had been in the moment of intervention. The turning point came quietly, without fanfare. An internal review panel concluded its preliminary findings and recommended disciplinary proceedings against the officer. The language of the report was careful but unmistakable. It cited deviations from protocol, failure to de-escalate, and inappropriate use of force given the circumstances. The recommendation did not yet determine final consequences, but it signaled a shift in institutional posture. The police union responded with a sharper tone, criticizing the review process and warning of a chilling effect on policing. The debate intensified, but the foundation had shifted. The narrative of unquestioned authority had cracked. Chuck received the news while sitting beside his wife on the couch, the afternoon light filtering through the window. He read the message twice before setting his phone down. He did not celebrate. The relief he felt was tempered by exhaustion and the knowledge that the process was far from over. That evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their living room, the television muted, Chuck spoke of responsibility rather than vindication. He reflected on the fine line between strength and excess, on how easily power could slip into abuse when unchecked. His wife listened, her hand resting on his, her other hand moving gently over her stomach as the baby shifted. They understood then that whatever the outcome, the experience had altered them. It had stripped away assumptions about safety and fairness, replacing them with a deeper awareness of vulnerability and resilience. It had also reaffirmed something essential, that truth, though often delayed and contested, had a way of surfacing when supported by evidence and persistence. The investigation moved toward its next phase. Formal hearings scheduled, testimonies prepared. The public attention remained intense, but the tone had changed. Questions of accountability replaced speculation. The conversation widened, touching on policy, training, and the need for reform. As night fell, Chuck stood at the window once more, watching the city settle into darkness. The weight of the coming days pressed on him, but so did a quiet resolve. He had chosen restraint when violence would have been easier. He had chosen transparency when silence might have been safer. The truth was no longer just theirs to carry. It was moving forward, slowly but inexorably, toward a reckoning that would test the system itself. The final stage did not arrive with drama. There were no raised voices, no sudden revelations, no cinematic moments of triumph. Instead, it came the way accountability often does, through process, documentation, and decisions delivered in carefully measured language. By the time the disciplinary hearing convened, the initial shock of the incident had faded from public memory just enough for the system to believe it could speak plainly. The room where the hearing took place was unremarkable. Neutral walls, a long table, rows of chairs arranged to emphasize order and hierarchy. There were no cameras allowed inside, no live commentary, only a small number of observers permitted to attend. Yet the weight of the case pressed heavily on everyone present. What was being examined was no longer just a single officer's conduct, but the mechanisms that had enabled it. Chuck sat beside his wife, aware of the subtle tremor in her posture, the way she braced herself before each new stage of testimony. She had insisted on being there, not because she wanted to relive the experience, but because absence felt too close to surrender. She had spent years advocating for patients who were dismissed or overlooked. Now she was determined not to disappear from her own story. The proceedings unfolded methodically. Evidence was introduced and contextualized. Video footage was played, not for shock value, but for clarity. The angles left little room for reinterpretation. The progression from initial contact to physical restraint was undeniable, as was the absence of any credible threat that would have justified the level of force used. Medical testimony followed, outlining the physiological risks associated with acute stress and physical pressure during pregnancy. The language was clinical, precise, and devastating in its neutrality. When the officer was called to speak, his earlier confidence had eroded into something brittle. He described his perception of events, his reasoning, his sense of urgency. Yet the words felt thin against the weight of documented reality. Questions followed, direct and unyielding, probing inconsistencies and omissions. Each attempt to justify his actions circled back to the same unavoidable conclusion. He had escalated where restraint was required, exerted power where judgment was needed. The panel deliberated privately. The waiting that followed was almost unbearable in its quiet. Chuck felt his wife's hand tighten around his, and he returned the pressure gently, anchoring them both. In that stillness, he reflected on how far they had come from the fluorescent-lit chaos of the pharmacy. The path had been exhausting, marked by doubt, scrutiny, and the slow erosion of certainty. Yet here they were, standing at the threshold of resolution. The decision, when it came, was delivered without flourish. The officer was terminated from his position, effective immediately. The findings cited violations of use of force policy, failure to de-escalate, and conduct unbecoming of the role he had sworn to uphold. Further action, including potential criminal review, was referred to the appropriate authorities. The language was restrained, but its implications were clear. There was no applause, no collective release of tension, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had been set right, however imperfectly. Outside the hearing room, reporters waited, eager for statements and reactions. Chuck declined to speak. His wife did as well. They had learned that not every truth needed to be delivered into a microphone. Some truths were better carried forward through action rather than sound bites. In the days that followed, the media cycle moved on, as it always did. Another story emerged. Another controversy captured public attention. Yet the ripples of the case continued beneath the surface. Internal reviews were announced. Training protocols were revisited. The department, under sustained pressure, committed to changes it could no longer postpone. Whether those changes would endure remained uncertain, but the acknowledgement itself marked a shift. For Chuck and his wife, the quiet return to personal life was both a relief and a challenge. The apartment felt different now, not because it had changed, but because they had. The sense of unquestioned safety they once carried had been replaced by a more cautious awareness. Still, they worked to rebuild routine, to reclaim ordinary moments from the shadow of what had happened. As her due date approached, the focus gradually shifted inward. Medical appointments resumed their familiar cadence. Preparations continued, the unfinished list from that morning before the mall finally completed. Each small task felt significant, a step toward normalcy. The night labor began was calm. There was no panic, no rush born of fear. The hospital lights were softer than those of the pharmacy, the voices around them trained to soothe rather than command. Chuck stayed close, attentive and present, his earlier helplessness replaced by purposeful support. When the baby finally arrived, the world narrowed once more, this time not in terror, but in awe. Holding their child for the first time, Chuck felt the weight of the past months recede, not vanish, but settle into perspective. The fragility he had witnessed now shared space with resilience. The fear that had once tightened his chest gave way to a quiet, profound sense of responsibility. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its gentle rhythms. Sleepless nights, small triumphs, moments of doubt and joy intertwined. The story of the mall incident became something they referenced less frequently, not out of denial, but because it no longer defined them. It had shaped them, yes, sharpened their understanding of power and vulnerability, but it did not own their future. One evening, as Chuck stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on, he reflected on the lesson that had emerged from the chaos. Strength, he had learned, was not measured by the ability to dominate or overpower. It was measured by restraint, by the courage to intervene without surrendering to rage, by the willingness to stand firm when silence would be easier. Behind him, his wife sat cradling their child, her expression peaceful. The tension that had once haunted her eyes finally eased. The storm had passed. Not without cost, not without scars, but with something essential preserved. The truth had endured. Accountability had followed. And in the quiet that remained, a new life had begun, carrying forward the promise that even after injustice, balance could be restored.